Thank you all for coming on a gray but nice spring morning. This is the jam session, Lessons from Katrina, hosted by the Pratt Disaster Resilience Network as part of Pratt Institute's Earth Action Week, Spring 2021. My name is Leonel Lima Ponce. I am the academic coordinator of Pratt's Master of Science, Sustainable Environmental Systems, and the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment, where PDRN, the student group, is hosted. This spring's Pratt Earth Action Week is going to continue the focus we've been having since the onset of the pandemic, examining the ongoing and intersecting crises of climate change, COVID-19 pandemic, and the racial and social justice protests that have brought into relief systemic inequalities and unsustainable systems. But in addition to that, this semester, we're aligning with the creative and forward-thinking and solution-driven spirit of the Pratt community and students such as the ones that will be presenting today, and focusing on a just, sustainable, and prosperous recovery. The theme is recover, renew, reconnect. Without further ado, and I would like to actually thank the Pratt Sustainability Center for hosting this and every other Pratt Earth Action Week, as well as the coordinators, headlined by Carolyn Schaefer, who directs the Pratt Sustainability Center. Without further ado, I'd like to yield the floor to Liana Molnar and Agatha Naik, who are going to be hosting us on behalf of PDRN. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Leonel, for the introduction. Before we start the event, we'd just like to mention a bit about our group and what a jam session is. So we're Pratt's Disaster Resilience Network, which is PDRN, and we were originally founded in response to Hurricane Sandy by Pratt students, and we were reactivated last year in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're a student-led initiative focused on addressing systemic and intersecting crises through efforts to elevate community expertise, hold space for learning and growth, and create a lasting network of partnerships within and outside of the Pratt community. We meet weekly on Fridays at 11, and anyone who's a student at Pratt who's interested in joining is more than welcome. Amongst the events, we host our jam sessions, which are informal discussions between PDRN members and outside participants on a selected topic. General rules of the jam session include respectfulness towards each other, including not talking over one another and ensuring that this is a safe space for open discussion. Feel free to ask questions and hopefully we'll be able to learn from each other. A more comprehensive list of guidelines can be found in the chat that someone should be putting in there right now. Today's jam session is our second and final of the semester, and we will have an upcoming event in collaboration with the new school, which Sophia will briefly discuss in a second. Sophia?
Thanks, Leanna. So I'm just, actually, can the host enable my ability to screen share so I can share the poster for the event?
Yeah, try now.
Okay, great. Can everybody see this poster? Awesome. So as Leanna mentioned, one of the other events that PDRN is hosting this semester is a speaker series in partnership with Professor Juan Camilo Osorio and partners at the New School. And our upcoming event is next Thursday, April 15th, and we're going to be hearing from Josephine Castillo about grassroots women leadership contributions in disaster situations. And then our final speaking event for this panel, for this event series, will be a panel on April 22nd, where we'll be hearing about nourishing communities of life, Indigenous resurgence beyond syndemic violence and earth crisis. So we encourage you all to check out these two events and RSVP. I'll post the link in the chat so it's easy to find more about the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. So we're about to start. It looks like Agatha's network might have cut out for a second. So until she comes back, Carolyn, it looks like you were automatically made the host. Might you be able to switch that back to me?
Yes, 1 second.
Sorry, give us a minute for technical difficulties.
You should be all set.
Okay, perfect. Give me 1 sec and I will share my. Okay, can everyone see my screen here? Okay, perfect. Just gonna need to toggle back and forth until it gets back, sorry. So as mentioned earlier, our topic for this jam session is looking at the impacts of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans specifically. We were inspired to choose this topic after having listened to the podcast Floodlines, an episode of which was one of the suggested materials for today's discussion. So if you've not listened to the entire podcast, we highly recommend it, but we will play some clips throughout today's presentation, just to highlight a few things. So Agatha and I have prepared a brief presentation based on some of the resources that were shared with you. During the presentation, if you have anything, oh, Agatha's back. If you have anything to add, feel free to. We are far from experts, and our presentation will be followed by some discussion questions or general thoughts and comments from you guys. But again, feel free, this is sort of an open platform. It's not a formal presentation. So if you have any questions that you want to ask or anything that you want to say or comment on during the presentation, feel free, and then we'll kind of just have an open discussion at the end.
I'm back, so sorry about that. My internet now.
Let me make you host. Okay.
Sorry, everyone. All right. All right, so Leanna did the introduction. Yes, okay. So on August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the coast of Louisiana. It is considered one of the most destructive hurricanes in US history. Katrina made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane affecting nearly 92,000 miles of the Gulf Coast. The damage took the lives of approximately 1,800 people, displaced over 800,000 people, many of which were residents of color, and resulted in upwards of $100 billion in damage. Environmental effects of the storm also include 4 oil spills and the destruction of miles of natural habitat. The hurricane and the response or lack thereof highlight many issues regarding inequity in disaster resiliency and environmental racism. And this map over here on the right just shows the path of the storm. And right here is the 29th when it hit the coast. So New Orleans was particularly vulnerable to the storm due to its geographical location. Although half of the city does lie above sea level, the average elevation is 6 feet below sea level, and the city is completely surrounded by water. Over the course of the 20th century, the Army Corps of Engineers had constructed a system of levees and seawalls to keep the city from flooding. This graphic shows which areas are below sea level, highlighted in dark and light red. New Orleans, like many US cities, is racially segregated. Historically, white populations settled along the river and the ridges, while even higher income and middle-class Black households ended up settling in lower-lying areas, such as the 9th Ward. These areas in the city were more prone to flooding. A large part of the destruction that occurred in the days after Katrina was a result of over 50 failures in levees and flood walls protecting New Orleans and its suburbs. The responsibility and the design and construction of the levee system belongs to the United States Army Corps of Engineers. It's estimated 80% of New Orleans was flooded as levees began to break and leak, leaving many people who stayed behind estranged on their roofs as water rose up to 10 feet high. The images here show some examples of the levee failure. Water can be seen spilling over the Inner Harbor Navigational Canal in the first photo. Despite attempts by the Army Corps to blame the size of the hurricane for flooding, investigations revealed that the primary cause of flooding was a result of inadequate design and construction. Before the storm, there was a concern that the surge would overtop some levees and cause short-term flooding. However, no one predicted the scale. In preparation for the storm, Louisiana called a state of emergency on August 26th, followed by a voluntary evacuation order by the mayor of New Orleans that only became mandatory one day before the storm on August 28th. With a large percentage of the city's low-income population without modes of transportation, the Superdome, a stadium, was opened as an evacuation site for those who could not leave the city. So here's a photo of how the Superdome looked. FEMA and the federal government were heavily unprepared for how bad things were in New Orleans. It took FEMA days to establish operations. The Superdome, which had been designated as an emergency evacuation center, had minimal supplies to begin with and eventually reached full capacity. People in search of resources broke into the Ernest N. Memorial Convention Center, but there were no resources there. And despite FEMA knowing that people had moved to the convention center, resources were never delivered and people were left stranded. Michael Brown, the FEMA director at the time, initially denied knowing about those resigning in the convention center, but eventually was forced to resign along with the New Orleans Police Department superintendent. Reactions to the government's response were starkly divided along racial lines. In a national poll conducted on September 6, 2005, Black participants were more critical of the federal government's response. 2/3 of Black participants surveyed argue that the government's response to the situation would have been faster if most of the victims had been white. Just 17% of white participants agreed. The government's failure to maintain the infrastructure and organize evacuation plans led to disadvantages among the city's Black population specifically. The crisis unfolding was not just a result of failing levees, rather the flood only exacerbated long-standing realities of inequality. The city founded the Bring Back New Orleans Commission in September following the storm, that eventually advocated for the allocation of recovery resources to the highest and least damaged areas, only later to depopulated flood regions. This plan was met with pushback led by grassroots neighborhood associations and civic groups. Some coverage focused on the disaster as an opportunity for change and rebuilding. However, attempts to institute the radical changes were also critiqued by victims of disaster for misallocation of resources or opportunistic scheming.
Okay, so moving on to the media influence, which is a big topic that Floodlines discusses. I'm gonna play a clip right now, but just keep in mind that at this time in history, obviously it was the era of 24/7 news broadcast. It was when people were very reliant on news media to get their information. The internet was not as common, and people were very much dependent on getting their events from, TV and media. So let me make sure that this is working, but.
New Orleans was almost a dead zone.
I had to go all the way up to the roof to get that signal. I had a Verizon at that time. Can you hear me
went
now?
up to the roof.
I'm going to give them that shout out. Verizon was.
Alice and her family had one other line to the outside, a working TV.
Most of New Orleans is underwater tonight.
They would get together and watch one channel, Channel 4.
Good evening, I'm Bob Schieffer. For the people along the Gulf Coast, it is a catastrophe.
They'd tune in and watch the catastrophe unfold on TV. The catastrophe they were experiencing.
Billions in damage and a death toll that cannot yet be calculated.
They would see reports about all the people who hadn't been saved yet, while they were waiting to be saved.
We have been touring the flooded streets of New Orleans today. We'll have full coverage throughout the hurricane zone tonight, what FEMA now calls the most significant natural disaster to ever hit the United States.
It was surreal. Strictly speaking, some of it wasn't real at all. Misinformation is common after any disaster. In fact, it's so common it has a name, disaster myth. But the myth-making after Katrina was extreme. So extreme that in the days after the storm, it was like New Orleans existed in two parallel universes. One was the universe that Alice lived in, stuck in that house in the Lower Ninth Ward. The other was the one she was watching on TV. In the real universe, people like Alice were doing their best to keep each other alive, with no help from the outside.
Katrina, now a mere tropical depression over the state of Tennessee.
In the media universe, everything was distorted.
But the disaster it left behind grows by the hour, and it is not simply a natural disaster tonight. It is becoming the sort of disaster humans cause. There is looting and lawlessness overwhelming.
In the eyes of the media, it was often the victims themselves who were to blame.
Well, Aaron, you mentioned the danger from Mother Nature, from the flooding and like that. There's another danger here in New Orleans tonight, and it's from some of the people who are still here.
The worst of Mother Nature may have passed. The worst in men is still a problem.
So that kind of highlights just how the media was portraying this disaster. There was a story of looting, and there were partial or secondhand reports that led to unreliable information. The particular narrative of chaos and looting was fixated on throughout the media, and the media tended to show the same reels of usually people of color looting stores for supplies, with much of the media trying to call people out on their poor behavior, even though they were trying to survive without government assistance. So there was a lot of victim blaming happening, and a lot of racism happening. You also had the violence narrative. And in one of the examples later in the podcast that they give, there's a news broadcaster that says, "We've just gotten a very disturbing report from inside the city of New Orleans from our own correspondent in there, Jeff Goldblatt, who says he's just witnessed citizens of New Orleans walking around with AK-47s on the streets." So that report turned into another quote that said, "Two guys, he told me, with AK-47s, just shooting at police officers. No one was hurt. The guys fled into the French Quarter. They got away." So this made it seem, this like misinformation and this cyclical kind of thing, made it sound like the city was being taken over by violent community offenders, when in reality, the police or the local security were the ones most likely carrying the firearms. Most importantly, this induced mass panic, especially for aid workers looking to get into the city, and vastly delayed response time until order, quote unquote order, could be restored. Moving on to equity, which obviously overlaps with this a lot. This type of media influence obviously proposed a lot of equity issues. Many of the population of, or much of the population of New Orleans is Black, and the primary response of the media to this city definitely had something to do with racism and assumption. According to the census, 67.3% of New Orleans population that was single race Black as of July 1st, 2005, was single race Black as of July 1st, 2005. The Black population was the largest race or ethnic group in the city before Katrina hit, and at 58.8% remained the largest race or ethnic group in the city immediately after Katrina hit in 2006. So clearly this says something about the mobility of Black residents, because the decline in population, as you can see in the graph on the slide here, was immense, but the majority of residents were still Black in the Black community. And so through all this misinformation, for the people whose homes were underwater and had nowhere to go, they were directed toward the Superdome or the Convention Center for safety, as Agatha previously mentioned. But because the media was stating the Superdome was a war zone and a site of extreme violence, many of them instead opted for the Convention Center, but all of the resources were going to the Superdome. And inside the convention center, there was no food, no running water, and no toilets, only National Guardsmen that also had no supplies, except for their guns. And so I'm gonna play another clip, and this clip is about a woman named Leanne, and it's her story about how she got to the convention center after her home was flooded. She lived in a public housing building, and the first 6 floors or whatever were flooded, and so her and her family had to evacuate, walk through miles of water to arrive at the convention center with no supplies. So here's this clip.
To blockbusters, scandals, and successes. Available now wherever you get your podcasts.
The Ernest Morial Convention Center is a landmark. It's absolutely huge. Takes up about 10 city blocks in downtown New Orleans. If you're driving towards the river, you can see it on the horizon. Like a stadium or an airport, it's one of those places that you think is going to be around forever. That's why, even though it was never an official shelter during Katrina, you can understand why people decided to go there. Leanne Williams and her family had heard horror stories about the violence and conditions in the Superdome. The rumors got to them too. So they decided to head for the convention center instead.
We got off on the Chapatula exit and we were sitting under the bridge. And me and my cousins, Ariel, Arshadika, Jesse, and Jessica, we was playing pity pat. And the cars was worn down because they've been through water and everything in my backpack.
The kids entertained themselves playing cards. They'd had a rough couple days. If they were looking for some relief as they entered the convention center, they didn't find it.
I just remember it being hot, smelly. Just was a smell like people ain't take a bath in days and people crammed up in the heat. It was stank. And then the bathrooms were overflowed. When my little brother cried to use the bathroom and we went in there with my mom, the toilets was filled with urine and poo and it was all in the sink and he just had to use the bathroom on the floor because he couldn't go into the bathroom stall. They had it everywhere.
Mayor Nagin had made the Superdome the official refuge of last resort. The government had brought troops, medicine, food, and water there. But none of that stuff was at the convention center.
When we made it there, my stepdad and Jumpin' Jack left to go find food. And I remember them coming back with Poke skins and like 3 cans of beans. So we just was sitting there, sitting there. Nighttime coming.
And I'm gonna skip a part of this. I wanted to highlight the conditions that they were faced upon their arrival in the convention center. But the part I'm skipping is a montage of news clips more about the misinformation surrounding the level of violence happening in the Superdome and how the convention center was not receiving any of the same resources that the Superdome was. And there were also rumors about people getting shot at the Superdome. And when they ended up searching all 19,000 people, only 13 weapons were found. So you can see kind of the huge, vast expanse of this misinformation and these rumors that were traumatizing people to the point of not even going to the Superdome, even though that was the place with resources. So here's the last clip.
Chief was of a place that was too dangerous to save. The only authorities that Leanne encountered were a small detachment of National Guardsmen who were holed up there before the storm. They were there to fix levee breaches. Leanne could see them huddled together when she looked up at the floors above her.
And they're just sitting up there like with the rifles on them. And they're not telling us nothing, they're just watching us.
The National Guardsmen set up their staging ground in an exhibit hall. But they weren't actually equipped to help the people around them. They were stranded too. Leadership told those guardsmen not to enter the crowd because it might get out of control. But Leanne didn't know all that. All she saw was military personnel with their guns trained on her.
Like not interacting with us, telling us what's going on, just sitting in the ceiling with rifles on them. Like in a position ready to shoot. So I didn't understand why they was doing it instead of men down here helping us or bringing food and water. Like, why are we being treated like dogs? The way I felt, I was like, well, damn, they left us here to die. Like, they really don't care. Who cares about a poor black 14-year-old girl? Who worrying about me? Who wants to come save us? They showing us not nobody.
Leanne's aunt heard that somebody was going to send buses to come pick everyone up. But at this point, Leanne hadn't seen any authorities willing to help. She'd had to find her own food. Her family had to walk to the convention center on their own. When they got there, the only soldiers they could find pointed their guns at them. If she had any hope that somebody might view her as worthy of rescue, that hope was long gone now.
I'm like, they lying, we still here, I'm hearing all this, so now I'm starting to see that nobody's coming for us. So I told my mom, I said, I just yanked on my mom. I remember she turned to me and I just cried. I said, Mom, just tell me the truth, we gonna die. And she was like, what? I said, nobody's not coming to save us. I said, they don't care about us. I said, the president, nobody is coming. I said, we still here, no food, no water. I said, I'm not my brother and my sister, I'm older, I understand. I said, just tell me the truth.
So I wanted to highlight that, just not only to highlight her story, but also just to put into perspective the lived experience of African Americans and that community in this crisis, and how desperate people were and how unhelpful the government was to a vast majority of this population. So moving on to post-Katrina recovery. So at this time, shortly after Katrina, obviously a lot of flooding had damaged a lot of the homes, especially in low-income neighborhoods. And so there was a whole big deal happening with this low-income housing unit that was Leanne's old housing unit. And so 4,500 low-income apartments were torn down to create middle-income housing. And there was a lot of protests happening. The community was severely against it. It was their homes. They didn't want to move out, obviously. But obviously the people in power voted actually unanimously to tear down this housing unit. And so this kind of depicts the problem that started to arise in New Orleans, particularly a planning problem where the vacancies increased when people didn't return. And so people were concerned about who was going to buy up the land. And during New Orleans recovery, the white population moved back much faster than the Black population. And so many neighborhoods were filled with destroyed lots that were no longer in use, but that white people were more likely to take up and change the neighborhood characteristics. So this obviously poses a problem for gentrification as the social landscape and land use designations were changing. I just wanted to highlight this New York Times article, Agatha, if you would be so nice to pull it up, because it shows a really interesting depiction of several maps that are relevant. So if you just scroll down a little bit, just to give you some even more great geographic context. I know you saw the map earlier. Loading. Okay, so in this map, it's depicting the vastness of the flooding, and so you can see that all of the dark blue parts are where the flooding occurred, and a lot of those dots are community facilities or public facilities that were completely underwater. You can scroll down. Here you can see where the businesses were flooded, I think, and the areas of darker blue is the areas where more people were concentrated and more businesses were concentrated, whereas the orange is like where they're not as significantly flooded. And then particularly here in the French Quarter, you can see the number of employees that were affected by this. And you can see where the people, this is where people were applying for aid. So you can see where those people moved to and where they were applying to aid from. So you can see they spread out all across the United States, but a lot, the majority of them, I would say, were staying in New Orleans, probably because they didn't have the mobility to leave. And then the other two are just showing vacancies, showing what kinds of homes were replacing those vacancies. But I think we can go back to the PowerPoint now. I just wanted to quickly show that. Another post-Katrina recovery problem that we have besides gentrification is the future flooding concerns. So there was a $15 billion investment in the levees, but despite that, it's unclear whether or not they'll be able to withstand the rising sea levels posed by climate change. So that's also something that we should be thinking about in terms of whether or not to relocate people, whether or not to, build stronger levees and rely on that technology, or some other kind of mix of those. And then this slide, I just wanted to highlight this quote since it highlights some of those planning issues that I was discussing before that the community was experiencing at a time. So the narrator asked for his primary feelings about post-Katrina recovery. And he says, "My primary feelings, I don't know what it is. It's a combination. It's a gumbo. It ain't one thing. It's multiple things. But thank God for blessing me with the ability to think, to understand what I'm looking at. Because in New Orleans, we had a Katrina. In other places, they didn't have a Katrina, and it's happening to them. And it's called gentrification. People make communities. 7th, 6th Ward, 8th Ward, 9th Ward. I don't care what ward you're in. The absence of these people is the change in the community. The absence of those people is a radical change in those communities." And his name is Fred Johnson. So that sort of concludes our big presentation, but clearly the system is built on an old mechanical top-down idea of the city. It sees the city as a collection of parts that need to be rationally segregated and recombined to work properly, just as the parts of an engine are rationally segregated by function. If there is something wrong with one of these segregated compartments, the way to fix it is to target the spot with some additional top-down resources. If people lack housing, build some new housing for them. If a street is too congested with traffic, build a wider road or even a freeway. And we'll provide some more resources too if you are interested in researching some more about that. But on the screen right now is some questions that we wanted to pose to the group for open discussion. So if anyone feel free to unmute yourself. You should have that access. And we can start with the first question, which is, just sort of an easy one, but is it important to talk about previous disasters and why? And, how are we dealing with that now? And how can we, like in COVID-19, and how are we going to learn from, these future things? Sorry, Agatha, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna build on thinking about possibly COVID, but yeah. Okay. If anyone has any thoughts.
I mean, I can start. Is it important to talk about previous disasters? Absolutely. I think that we're in a particular stage as well where we don't have a Katrina right now. We had a Sandy. I mean, I wasn't in New York when we had Sandy, so I'm sure a lot of people in this Zoom room can have some experience with that and maybe talk about your experience then, but it poses a really important lesson for us to, in terms of community resiliency, in terms of preparedness, and what problems arise and how can we plan for those in the future. And so I think that it's extremely important, and also just, something that we should always be thinking about in terms of preparedness.
I just wanted to say thank you very, very much to the team, the Pratt Disaster RD team. Thank you very, very much for your work and for lifting this up via this jam session. Very, very grateful for your presentation in particular. My name is Ray Figueroa. I am concentrated in the South Bronx, albeit I work all over the city. I'm with the New York City Community Gardens Coalition. So it's a coalition, a citywide coalition of community gardens. And I actually oversee a community garden initiative. It's an alternative to incarceration via a youth farm in the South Bronx. What I wanted to say, though, is it important to talk about previous disasters? Ostensibly, that's a very intuitively obvious question that has a very obvious answer. I just wanted to link it to actually what happened in Haiti vis-a-vis the earthquake in 2010, and specifically just wanted to lift up. There was a news analysis, not reportage as you guys were referring to here, but an in-depth analysis that's the title of which I'm paraphrasing was "The Disaster Before the Disaster." I mean, in myself and colleagues, if you were to visit with us in the South Bronx and similarly situated communities around the city or around the country, similarly situated as the South Bronx, before the pandemic, before Sandy, and in that interim period, 2012 to 2020, we already had food lines all over. And I have a colleague in the field that said, Ray, this community is in a disaster. Look at all of these food lines. You know, they were all, you know, there's already a major issue around food insecurity. Why? Because that's informed by something known as rent burden. And rent burden is actually, you know, has a degree. There are demographic categorizations of very low income and extremely low income folk. That's anywhere from $10,000 per year up to something like $46,000 per year for a family of three. The extremely low income is between 10 and 20. And then you have the very low income. Anyway, the point being is that those households, and it's not a little bit, it's quite a significant bunch of folks, are extremely, are regarded as severely rent burdened. What that means is that it implicates food insecurity. So people are not eating. So this is a disaster already, poverty and rent burden. And what happens, you know, folks do, you know, you alluded to the news reports around looting. Well, there is an underground economy in these types of communities that are so impacted by economic disasters, man-made economic disasters. And so there's an underground economy. A number of the youth in my alternatives to incarceration program at the youth farm, they've, any number, I'm looking at some of them as I'm speaking, and say, Ray, I was selling the nickel bags, i.e., you know, selling marijuana or selling crack. I was just selling the nickel bags and the dime bags just to get money to eat. So the idea being, and you had Leanne speaking about nobody coming and nobody caring. Well, her remarks imply a deeper issue around community resilience. You know, the community resilience issue in the face of folks were already on an edge. What Katrina did was push them over the edge. As in the South Bronx, an environmental justice community, meaning that it's super overburdened with adverse environmental impacts as a result of industrial being located right next to residential, located right next to massive transportation. So anyway, just saying that these are issues that we need to be addressing ongoing. If not, we're just going to have, you know, vis-a-vis the COVID-19 and whatever is coming as a result of climate change, and it is coming. So we really do need to be thinking about what will make people resilient. And I'm aware that it did happen in the wake of Katrina, the community gardens organized themselves here in the South Bronx, in the north region of the Bronx, in the east region, in the west and the southern region, into groups of community gardens, farming hubs. And we committed and dedicated ourselves to aggregating harvests to be able to distribute more food. So community organizing and having community gardens, actually, unplugging community gardens, actually, and the capacity for a community to do for itself.
100% agree with you on the community gardens aspect. I also really like that you pointed out that, you know, there's two types of disasters. There's like the immediate disaster and there's the ongoing disaster, and all of those things that we need to prepare for. I totally agree. I just had a question for you. Were you in New York during Sandy, and were you involved with the community gardens there? And sort of, can you speak to a little bit just how they were impacted?
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Actually, that Leonel is aware of the work that I do. I'm also on the faculty at SES. I teach the Sustainable Urban Agriculture class coming up actually this summer. If any of you are interested. Well, community gardens and Superstorm Sandy. What happened, there's a section of New York City, all the coastal areas, as you well know, were flooded. One particular area stood out amongst a number of areas, and that was the Lower East Side of Lower Manhattan. I'm not sure if any of you, if you're from New York City or are familiar with New York City, but that's a section of Manhattan that is in the southern part of Manhattan and right by the coast, right by the river's edge. Very severely flooded. So much so, the flooding was so intense. There's a Con Ed power plant there. It was flooded, it exploded, power went out, and people were actually devastated, particularly in the public housing developments there. A very interesting phenomenon. That's an area with a lot of community gardens as well. In the wake of the flooding and the residing of the waters, damage wherever there were community gardens located, damage to the adjacent buildings was less than if it had been just a building and just a built structure next to the building. In other words, flooding damage was worse where there were no community gardens located, meaning that the ecosystem service of storm water runoff and flood absorption really helped. So in the wake of that, we, the Community Garden Coalition, was able to get a storm recovery grant, a $2 million grant from the state of New York to really enhance the green infrastructure, community gardens as a green infrastructural asset for vulnerable communities, climate change induced extreme weather event vulnerable communities like the Lower East Side. And that's not the only area. We're working in the South Bronx. We're doing similar work to enhance green infrastructure assets vis-a-vis community gardens. So not only in terms of food production, raised bed planting helps not only to absorb water, composting, the things that people are talking about vis-a-vis the municipal waste system and really being more effective and efficient and ecologically conscious of handling the organic portion of the waste stream. All of these things really enhance not only the environmental resilience of a community, but also the social resilience of a community.
Thank you for that. That's very, it puts a good perspective on community gardens and just that they're so useful for everything in all aspects. Did anyone else have a comment? We can also move on to the next question, but open the floor again.
There was a comment from Todd in the chat. I don't know, Todd, if you want to say it out loud, that I might want to respond to as well, but I'll let Todd take over if he wishes to speak it. All right, so I'll respond.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, sorry. I'm kind of multitasking here. I'm teaching a class in an hour or so. Okay, let me reveal myself here. So, hello, thanks. I very much appreciate this panel for Earth Action Week. Yeah, I was just commenting that, for a long time, I did a bunch of work, artwork around disasters that actually started around with the one with 9/11 in 2001, and part of that actually I put Katrina, but it started then. The whole question within the U.S. is of why us, why me, why do people hate us so much? Folks that were around that time, that was the big kind of question that was circulating in the media, right? What did we do wrong, right? That we deserved, the Twin Towers. collapsing, what led up to the Twin Towers collapsing. And so I think part of that was this kind of notion of US exceptionalism, because part of what I started tracking in terms of disasters then is that, especially natural disasters, quote unquote, right? Because always seem to be in the media happening somewhere else. And even though disasters were happening at various places in the US, it was always kind of like, these things were just sort of like anomalies. But the real disasters always happened in, the underdeveloped world, or quote unquote, the third world, in poor places, because, because of people there can't seem to like create enough infrastructure, and they don't have enough resources to sort of deal with all this stuff, right? So that's what I mean by that US exceptionalism. And then, eventually I think Katrina kind of brought that, kind of created that that reality. It is not in our backyard, it is in our yard, right? It's in front of us. There is no backyard, in that sense. The US is, all interconnected. We might kind of, sweep stuff under the rug, right? Because we don't want to see it. But yeah, it's there. So I think that was really important for Katrina to sort of like highlight the, not only that the disasters are inherent, that can happen anywhere, right? And a lot of it is because of humans, the human role played in that, but it also showed the inequities of this particular market system, and how it kind of perpetuates that, this kind of what I term the poverty, and Naomi Klein refers to as disaster capitalism. So one of the interesting things is that in a book called Storming the Wall, the thing is that in that book it says that, yeah, the US actually, they recognize the whole climate change issue, and they think of it as being really important. I don't know how the government does not believe this. They actually do, but it's a very perverted way of believing it. They actually believe it to the extent that they want to figure out how to market. And that means that, bigger military protection for the privileged, access for the privileged. So they are, preparing for climate change, but they're not preparing in terms of like, in terms of renewable energy and pushing, trying to figure out how to, kind of like keep that at bay for the benefit of the majority of people. They're just focusing on a particular elite group and how to maintain that with the threat of climate change. Thank you.
Yeah, as Delaney said in the chat, military industrial complex meets the disaster industrial complex for sure. Yeah, thank you for that.
And I just wanted to build on that a little bit. Those systems are ingrained, and they've taken advantage of an increasingly volatile situation where disasters have been handled as something government responds to, and as an incident, rather than a data point or an instance of a larger system that's accelerating and causing more and more damage more and more frequently as it intersects with an increasingly inequitable socioeconomic, racial society. And I think that intersection, really leaves communities, as we saw in New Orleans, as Ray discussed about the South Bronx and the Bronx in general, leaves them to fend for themselves and to find solutions like community gardens and to organize and collaborate together. And now, and typically that's at a place of disadvantage, though I keep pitching, I keep talking about this group this week, is the New York Renews Coalition in New York State. They're one of the coalitions built of these long-term advocates, or built from these long-term advocacy groups, that's really beginning to create a critical mass for a response that begins to hold these governmental agencies at this, at the city and state level and other coalitions are doing so at the federal level, that can actually try to change how government deals with disaster, deals with catastrophe, and integrates mechanisms to also deal with this inequality. And that's coming from communities themselves. And just jumping a little bit to question 4, I think that the roles that planners, artists, activists, and designers can have is to really look at how we can support those networks. Maybe it's in policy writing, maybe it's in data collection and visualization, maybe it's in creating designs that can be responsive to the actual needs of the populations that are at a disadvantage, rather than responding to and just in response to disaster, that are prescriptive, or sorry, that are proactive rather than reactive, right? That really take into account assets rather than try to respond to deficits. And I think that's how we move forward. And of course, it's much more complicated than that, but it's really in support of creative solutions that are emerging from those communities themselves.
Can I just add one thing, Lino? I think also we need to, one of the panels that was on here that Lionel was helping out with was the eco-socialism panel. So we actually need to, I mean, with all this stuff that's going on, mutual aid, all the stuff to, refer to as ground up, and kind of self-determinancy within communities. We also need to really think about the bigger goal pictures, right? Like just to quote Michael Eric Dyson about if unity is the bridge, right? We need to figure out how to unify. Justice is the destination. So we need to figure out we can't be moving incrementally policy by policy. It also needs to, that's important, but it also we need to also think about the macro political interconnections and how those things need to shift too, right? So we need goals. The goals are, and also to quote another person, demand the impossible, be realistic, demand the impossible, Che Guevara.
Yeah, please go ahead, Maya.
Thanks. I just wanted to jump in here for a second. So my name is Maya, and I'm coming to you from Silks Okanagan Territories, which in English is known as Kelowna, the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. I'm a third-year fine arts student at UBC, and I'm stalking all of your events because they're so incredible. So I've been listening in all week, and this is the first time I'm sort of giving voice to some of the thoughts that have been swirling around in my head. I agree. I want to address point number 4, but I really want to address it within the context here. So if you are willing to bear with me for about 3 minutes, I'm going to ramble for just a second here. I am a 55-year-old woman, and I'm going back for my first university degree. My professional training is mom of 6 kids and business owner, and I'm a senior staff instructor for PADI. So I've done a lot of underwater cinematography on the Barrier Reef and in Southeast Asia. So I came back to university because I realized that a lot of the stories that I was capturing on film were being given as footage to other producers who were not people who looked like me, or people who looked like Ray, or people who looked like many of you in this room. They weren't the same age or skin tone or gender. And so I really wanted to change that dynamic. And what I've been finding as I've been studying both the fine arts and environmental science is that I am being reverse mentored by the younger generation, by the dynamism and the activism and the awareness. But there's still a significant silo effect that's going on between universities. So not only does it go on inside of interdisciplinary situations within a university structure or within a city structure, but it's going on between universities. We have what's called the UBC Climate Hub that is very focused on social justice and environmental justice issues. And so the first thing that I want to do is invite offline from this conversation any of you who'd like to work with me to try to get some of the students from British Columbia connected with the students from New York. And the reason is because we have very similar issues, right? The second point is that I we own a home half-half with our son in New Orleans. He went to college in New Orleans. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. He went to college in New Orleans and never left, just fell in love with it and never left. And so we bought a home together, and we've been completely changing this 100-year-old home to make it environmentally generative as opposed to extractive, right? And we've been using that as a conversation piece with our neighbors. I think these kind of little micro steps are occurring all over. But what ends up happening is that people don't understand how to tell other people the stories, their own climate stories. We know from studies, you look at Yale Center for Climate, any of these, we know that what people respond to is personal stories. As designers, as artists, as storytellers, we have this fantastic opportunity to be able to connect all of those different puzzle pieces, but we're still operating from a relatively narrow silo. So in question number 4, when you say, how can we as planners within the context of the intermediary and as being communicators, how do we maximize this opportunity? And I think that part of what I want to say is that you're telling the story today of New Orleans, and we're talking about Hurricane Sandy and, all of these, we're talking about them as though they are past phenomenon and we have lessons to learn from the past phenomenon. But I think that the reality is that, and Ray can probably speak to this too, people of my generation, this is not the past. This is a thing that happened within the context of our lives that is still happening. And so we need an opportunity to create a brave space. It's not always going to be a safe space, right? We can create the container that makes it a comfortable space for people to be brave, but it's really scary and it doesn't always feel safe to talk about these experiences and to share them with each other. But if we're going to approach any type of iterative project design where we are engaging the community in everything from public art to design, I think that we need to figure out sooner rather than later ways of amplifying the best practices of generative design with iterative project implementation, with arts, faith, storytelling, and community engaged practices. I suspect that at Pratt, you're all talking about this quite a lot. But I'm curious about whether or not you're talking about it with each other when you're not in class. That's my first question. And my second question is, what do you do outside of the big events like this? This is an incredible event. But what sort of things does Pratt encourage you to do to connect up with other creative, committed, activist minds throughout the world? Those are my 2 questions, because I do think that they address some of the potential answers to question number 4.
Be a great answer for pre-pandemic entries to the program that didn't have to do their degree online.
I guess, and for that reason, I feel like I have a unique experience and that I was in school prior to the pandemic and doing a bit more of this type of work that I've been able to bring to Pratt. But I just want to, I guess, lift up the fact that I've been working with an environmental justice group in Charleston, South Carolina, who's also dealing with a lot of issues of environmental racism, and especially related to flooding and low-income communities. And actually this semester, it's been really cool because through, I think, basically all of my classes have been able to kind of gear or target a lot of the work that we've been assigned and to do work for this organization that they had not had the capacity to do. So doing like neighborhood demographic like change report and doing some economic development like analysis for some developments that are like major sources of gentrification, and kind of looking getting to use the classroom environment and the assignments specifically to do work for those organizations. So that's been really, I didn't expect that to kind of work out the way that it has, which has been really, really cool and been really well received by the organization as well. So I agree with James that, especially being online, that that it's hard to kind of do this from scratch. But I think also in general, like at Pratt, our studios are always engaged with real community groups in New York City and providing these types of like skills and knowledges and technologies to community groups that need the additional capacity. In general, is very much a part of a lot of Pratt's like ongoing relationships that they bring into the studio. So I don't know if that answers some of your question, but that's my 2 cents.
Just to build on that, you know, this of course, these experiences are specifically from the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment, and I'm sure Todd and Chris and others from other departments have different experiences, but our history is that of working with community, supporting community, environmental justice frontline, you know, low income, underserved, for lack of a better word at the moment, communities that have these ideas, have these concepts, have these assets, but also, you know, have asked for support. So we base our work on the support that is requested of us on long-term relationships, some emerging relationships, to really work with them through the studios, sometimes through coursework, through faculty like Ray that work in these communities and are sometimes from these communities themselves, and really, you know, trying to provide whatever other opportunities we can for those organizations to, you know, to benefit from our skills, and vice versa, for us to benefit from their knowledge and their skills and build together, right? This can be capstone projects, it can be theses, but it really comes out in full force in the studios and in granted research projects. But I'm sure there, you know, and I know there are different experiences in different departments, and Pratt is really actively trying to build that up more, you know, harkening back to its history from the 60s and 70s, where a lot of the departments really worked with the Bed-Stuy community and others in Brooklyn and beyond. I don't know if you want to build on that, and anybody else here?
Maybe I'll just throw out there if anyone has taken any of the resiliency studios, if they want to talk about kind of how that work overlaps with like the flood mitigation, that sort of thing. Delaney, do you want to take a
Sure. So maybe to try to bring it back to this conversation of Katrina too, you know, I'm in a studio right now with Ron Schiffman, Courtney Knapp, and Geeta Nandan, and we are working on the topic of managed retreat in the Rockaways. And this is, you know, it's a really contentious topic. It's really not something that communities want to talk about. We are dealing with this idea, and I think that this goes to question 2. You know, in speaking about the idea of managed retreat, we have to be really careful in making sure that work like that, work about assisted migration, work about dangerous or flood-prone areas, or work that revolves around risky areas, we have to make sure that this does not become the new redlining. We have to make sure that this does not become climate redlining, that the work, similar to this whole idea of like a disaster industrial complex, that in identifying communities who are living in these vulnerable areas, that by doing so, that does not continue to cause harm to those people, because you are now deeming them as living in these places that are unsuitable by whatever means that you're speaking of. And so I think that there is both a danger to the idea of managed retreat, but also an opportunity, because I've been learning about this a lot. I've been engaged with several groups outside of Pratt. To your point, Maya, been working with ASAP, the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, as well as the Climate Migration Network on this work. And you know, there are so many practitioners who are trying to understand the idea of planned versus unplanned. So, you know, when thinking about disasters, you should be planning, because in these unplanned situations, that's when the damage comes to pass. But there is that fine balance between thinking of these, I'm not going to say solutions, but thinking of these strategies to mitigate or adapt or move. You know, I think I might be rambling a little bit, but it all swirls together, and we have to be conscious of all of the impacts of what we do. Even if it's something that we think is the right thing to do, there will be implications no matter what happens. And that's, I think that mindset really goes to what we were learning at Pratt, is that, you know, everything is going to have a consequence, and we have to understand our work in that way at all times.
Just to follow up with that, Delaney or anyone else who has a perspective on this, I've been wondering, like, maybe what are the strategies that you talk about in your studio, or anyone else here has had in their professional life, about how to gain community buy-in for something like that, and how to sort of minimize those implications that you're talking about, in terms of, you know, comparing the safety of people comparatively to the community. Like how does that work, I guess?
You know, in our studio, we talk a lot about just the need for increased conversations and education around the topic, you know, as well as trust. There has to be some sort of a trust building, because there is a lot of lack of trust that is completely warranted towards these systems that have been racist towards people. And I think that I don't want to give a definitive answer really, but I think that it starts with that. It starts with trust and starting to build relationships, because that's the way that you get to have that community resiliency, is through trust and relationships.
I would say memory plays a lot into this, going back to Maya's comments as well. You know, it's, as I was saying in my chat comment, it's really tough to maintain support as a technical consultant, as a planner, as a working professional, when you're not, you know, in the movement, when you're not a member of an organization necessarily, and you're working in support of them, because you really there shouldn't be an expectation that that organization or that group or that community is there and ready to interact with you whenever you happen to be, right? And that creates some challenges. I mean, definitely from an academic institution perspective, in terms of timing, it creates challenges in terms of budget, it creates challenges in terms of matching initiatives and priorities at any point in time. But what can facilitate that is really creating an archive and creating a historical database of knowledge and of relationships that build over time, so that some of these connections are not lost, and that they can be accessed, and at least create a point of mutual education. And that's something that we tried to do with the RAMP initiative after Sandy, and something we're trying to bring back, is really to at least elevate these stories, elevate these relationships and this work, try to learn more from them, and have an additional place of content that has more context, and that allows us to build not from zero every time, not from one every time, but from the full extent of the work that we've done. That's hopefully something that will help with these initiatives, and just also trying to make to find to get some of the money from the federal government, get some money from the state government, and get some grants together that are longer term than 1 semester or 2 semesters, and really build these support networks. Because another piece is the planning fatigue. If nothing happens, from these different 1 semester, 1 year long relationships, if there is no outcome, communities get tired. That memory remains, right? The memory of false promises. And so setting expectations, but also setting up systems that can help support an expansion of those expectations is really critical, I think.
Could I speak up one more time, if that's all right? So again, I'm going to go back to how grateful I am that you've assembled all these fantastic speakers. I've learned quite a lot about sort of biomaterials and resources that we haven't discussed in our circles, so it's really been phenomenal. The primary issue that we deal with in environmental and social justice are Indigenous rights. In our area, we've made it as part of both provincial and federal law to uphold the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Persons. So the first part of that is about making every single plan with informed and prior and free consent, which means that as designers, we're wasting our time if we start to design without there being Indigenous partners there from the very beginning conversations, right? But that hasn't historically been the way that we've been taught in classes. And so we're in this learning on the fly kind of moment in history right now. And one of the things that I've been so impressed with here in this assemblage is the willingness for people to be very open and transparent about all of the failures as much as the successes. In each of the different talks that I've been listening to, people have said, well, I tried this and it didn't work, and I tried that and it didn't work, and I tried this and it didn't work. And I've been so impressed with that level of openness and transparency, because what it's doing is it's celebrating curiosity. And I think that's a universal characteristic that everybody can get around, whether you're in academia or whether you're a person who's experimenting in your own garden in the backyard and never went to any sort of formalized academic education. And it really goes back to this thought about there being alternative ways of knowing the world, right? You've got life experience and you've got oral storytelling, and then you've also got formalized academic education. So if we're going back to this question about memory and retaining memory, but also the transfer of knowledge from one person to another, or a group to another, or a generation to another, that would be my second question, is how much do you talk about the transfer of knowledge in alternative ways of knowing inside of your classes or inside of your workshops or capstone projects or community projects?
Well, I think there's been a huge emphasis, especially recently, on understanding how anything we work on affects people in different ways. And just in my experience in a couple of years of classes in this program, it's really embedded in every course. There's not only entire units kind of addressing the different ways things can be perceived and the different kinds of impacts that it has on different communities, but it's also kind of an underlying current in any project we talk about, whether it's on a very micro level with a particular building or a block, or whether it's at the city scale, what a law might do for different populations. It's just, I think we're at the point where we're not even intentionally carving out space to talk about it anymore, but it just happens. It's become something that's very natural to think about how different groups are affected differently by really anything we do as planners.
We had a small project that is still actually in its final phases. It started, a good couple of years ago through Pratt. Critical environmental areas. Again, about community gardens being securing this official governmental regulatory status known as critical environmental areas. It's actually never been, that regulatory designation has never been applied in an urban context. Notwithstanding that there are many ecological ecosystems and ecological support of habitats for any number of migrating species. Actually, though, the point, just building on Ben's point, good to see you, Ben, also, peace. And to build on his point, the way we're moving that project, it first started with students actually traveling around the city, visiting with the community gardeners, right? And talking with the community and listening to the community gardeners talk about what is meaningful, what is valuable to them about the space that the community has cultivated. And each community garden has its own very, very unique name that speaks to that community cultivation of space. So, talking about the cultural value, talking about the social value vis-a-vis food production, or the beauty, just being able to sit in a place of beauty that you help to cultivate is very viscerally, very resonant, particularly for folks who have come from an agrarian or rural background as a immigrant, or for those who did the Great Migration from the South, that is to say, African Americans. And then the students combine that level of, if you will, data documentation with the actual technical gathering of information around the ecosystem services. All of that now, that very rich body of documentation is now being used by Earth Justice, the environmental law firm. Earth Justice, I actually have a meeting with them on Monday. Why? Because Earth Justice is helping us with the advocacy, helping us, meaning the community, with the advocacy. The community organized itself around this. They bought into the project. Why? I should go back because Maya, you talked about consulting first and foremost with the indigenous community. And so, yes, there was immediate community buy-in because in New York City, one of the ongoing bordering on existential trepidations of community gardens is the precariousness of land tenure, right? And so, folks said, oh, if this is going to help us keep our community garden, we're all for it. So Earth Justice is now joined in to help community gardeners in terms of securing a status that would improve the land tenure of these community cultivated spaces that have very, very significant ecosystem, ecological, environmental, health promoting, and otherwise value. We were also able to, and this is a point that I probably would love, for Tom to hear. I don't see him, am I getting his name mixed up? Anyway, the gentleman that spoke earlier about eco-socialism, taking, this collaboration is very, very strategic, starting in the community and now moving forward to the point of formal advocacy before city agencies, before city elected officials. That's where we're at as we speak. So, and we've gotten a lot of increasing buy-in on the part of organizations as well as other members of the community. So I just wanted to share that with you, building off of Ben's point in terms of how do we take something from the community and move it in a way that we get beyond planning fatigue, as was alluded to earlier.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to end on, just thinking about the future of community projects and a positive for bringing everyone together to kind of make something that's helpful and equitable and, you know, all that good stuff. It's 11:28 and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So is there any like final burning thoughts that anyone would want to say in the last 2 minutes?
I'd just like to say that I added to the chat earlier our LinkedIn group where we welcome everyone who collaborated with us today to connect. We continue discourse there. You'll see all of our other events there. So please, Maya, I know you're not in the Pratt community, but you can join us there. Ray, we'd like to see you in that group as well. But thank you. Thank you so much, Leanna and Agatha, for a great jam session. You guys did a fantastic job.
Thank you guys for coming and for being here and participating in this discussion on your Friday morning.
Yeah, we were a bit nervous about the turnout, so it was really great to hear everyone's thoughts and to hear the discussion. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for putting this together.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys. Well, we hope to see you at our next jam session, probably in the fall, but have a wonderful weekend.
Sorry. Oh, and one last thing. Tomorrow we have a career event day actually from 12 to 2. You can find it on any of the Pratt social media. Ben is also helping us co-host it. So if you're interested in learning about people working within green jobs for just recovery, come join us tomorrow.
Can talk and network in this virtual time. All right, well, thank you again, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Peace
See you
and
soon.
Mother Earth's blessings.
Thank you. You too.